Let's understand how a service worker is registered. We have an index.html file which probably loads a app.js file. So this is all a traditional web application, nothing server workerish about it. Now in the app.js file, we can execute some code to register a service worker, which lives in its own JavaScript file. I'll show you this code in the next lecture. It's super simple. This is some code which tells the browser, hey, the content of the service worker.js file is JavaScript, but don't execute it right now as you do with all the other JavaScript files. Instead, please take it and register it as a background process, as a service worker. During that registration, two lifecycle phases are reached. First, the browser installs the service worker. During that, it emits an install event, which we can hook into to execute some code inside of the service worker whilst it is getting installed. You'll later see how we use that to cache some assets, some initial caching we want to do. There's another event which is executed as soon as installation finishes, once the service worker is activated. Now, it's not necessarily activated right after the installation finishes. It's activated as soon as it can be activated, which depends on the question whether there is an old version of the service worker running or not. Service workers will only get active if there's no old service worker instance running. So you might need to close existing tabs and reopen them to install a new version of the service worker, and I will show you how that works. This is required because a service worker is not attached to a single page, but to an overall domain or scope. And as I said, it lives on even if you close the tab. So you have to make sure that at least no tab is open to be able to replace it, because then Chrome or whichever browser you use basically knows, okay, it's now safe to switch it because no page is actively communicating with the service worker at least. So then once the browser decides that it can be activated, the activate event will be fired. And in case it's not clear how that exactly works, we'll go through all these steps in the next lectures. Once the service worker was activated, it now controls all pages of a given scope. I'll come back to scope 2. It basically means that you can decide which parts of your application are controlled by a service worker. Put in other words, which pages of your application can work with the service worker. So for example, if we want to listen to fetch events, well, if a page is outside of the scope of the service worker, the fetch listener in the service worker won't trigger upon fetch requests of the pages outside of the service worker scope. I'll show you how to set the scope in the next lectures too. Now, one important note about the install event, or about how the browser installs a service worker. You might wonder whether it always installs it whenever our application basically executes. So if we refresh the page, does it then install our service worker again? The answer is, it depends. It always executes this registration code, which you're about to see in the next lectures, but it doesn't necessarily install the service worker. It will only do that if your service worker file, so the file housing your service worker JavaScript code, changed by 1 byte or more. So if it changed at all, it will install the updated version. If it's the same file, if it is unchanged, then it will not install it. It will still execute the registration code, but in the registration step, it will basically make this check, recognize that the file might not have changed at all, and then not trigger the install event here. So that is something you have to keep in mind. The browser will only install a service worker if it is an updated version, or if it's for the first time ever that you have one, not on every page refresh. Once we have an activated service worker, it enters idle mode, which means it's basically just sitting there, because I told you it's a background process handling events, and if no events are coming in, it's doing nothing. After a time of idling around, it will terminate. This does not mean that it is uninstalled or unregistered, it just means it's kind of sleeping. You can wake it up though, or actually it will wake up automatically as soon as events are coming in. So for example, a fetch event. And all the other events, of course, also apply, the events I showed you on the previous slide. If a fetch event occurs, either due to an HTML file requesting a resource, or you actively sending a fetch request in your JavaScript code, the service worker is woken up and put back into idle mode. And of course, the fetch event listener is triggered there. This is the service worker lifecycle. Now let's have a look at this in our code, and let's see how we actually register, install, and activate a service worker, and what we have to watch out for.